Welcome, subscribers. Today we have a real treat in for us. Joseph Farrell is with us, the author, of course, of the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, with that incredible Dreamland we did with him, with Jim Mars and me. I'm still resonating from that, and now this is going to be equally incredible because none other than Peter Levenda, the author of the grandest, certainly, book about the interlocking conspiracies and secret societies that rule our world, or books, I should say, that has ever been written, is with us, the author of Sinister Forces, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And they are going to just have a little chat, and we're going to listen in. I'm going to be a fly on the wall. Welcome, both of you gentlemen.
Thank you, Whitley. It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, good. Joseph and Peter, welcome also to you.
Thanks very much, Whitley. It's a pleasure.
Peter, can you speak a little bit more directly into your telephone? It's very faint.
Okay, I'll try it. How's this sound?
That's much better. Okay, well, Peter, why don't you take it away? You've got some questions, I think, for Joseph, and maybe vice versa as well. We'll find out.
Very good. Hi, Joseph. Good to be talking to you.
Hello. Good to talk to you.
I've been fascinated. Are you? Thanks a lot. Well, I've become a fan of yours recently. I've been reading your books. I mean, it's really sort of a trilogy itself. And the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, of course, is the latest one, but Reich of the Black Sun was also absolutely fascinating. One observation I have to make is that, as somebody who's researched Nazi secret societies and things of that nature for years, I know how hard it is to do this kind of research, and I was really blown away by the documentation you had mustered in support of your thesis regarding the involvement of the Brotherhood of the Bell, as you call it, the scalar physics, the technology that the Nazis had developed, and its ramifications through paperclip, the Nazi scientists, the United States, all the way to today, and the UFO phenomenon as well. So, congratulations for that amount of work. I was very impressed with that.
Well, thank you very much.
And I know how hard it is. I mean, we have academic mainstream historians, and
right.
and they tend to cover the same things and over again, sometimes with a bit more detail, but they tend to not cover this material for reasons of tenure or, afraid of endangering endowments from wealthy patrons or whatever. So it's up to others to take this research and to pull it into light. And, there have been a lot of books written about material like this, and it's been all sort of speculative and imaginary, but in your case, you pulled together a lot of the relevant documents. I was interested, how did you come across initially the Witkowski material? I mean, what led you to this avenue of research in the first place?
Well, originally, as you know, the British author Nick Cook, who works for Jane's Defense Weekly, published an excellent study called The Hunt for Zero Point. And that's where I was first introduced to the subject of the bell and to Mr. Witkowski's research. And then my publisher, David Childress, actually had some of Witkowski's books in Polish. So I contacted Igor personally, and we developed kind of a online friendship and exchanged materials. And he told me that his 5 Polish books had been condensed into one English volume. It's been published in England, and it's a superb book called The Truth About the Wunderwaffe, which is a very, very thorough study of Nazi secret weapons. In my opinion, it's really the best one out there. And I base a lot of my research in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell on his material, particularly the 4th chapter in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, and then I in subsequent chapters extrapolate a bit more on what I think was involved with the physics of it than he does. But his research is really the standard that anyone interested in the bell has to consult as a kind of a jumping off point. It's just superbly documented.
Well, you started from that basis, and then you wound up really trying to follow this story into the post-war period,
right?
Which I found fascinating. I mean, you have basically the bell being transported by plane to either North or South America,
Right.
Were you able to pick up the pieces? I mean, the idea that it may have landed in Argentina, of course, is very interesting to me as somebody who's studied the Nazi phenomenon down in that part of the world.
Right.
There have been a lot of Nazi scientists down there, of course, and proliferating throughout the Perón regime. Stroessner, who just died, by the way, the president of Paraguay, who was responsible for helping to shield so many Nazis from the war crimes tribunals, and of course in Chile. So I was wondering, did you get much more information on the Latin American aspects of this?
Well, the only information I've been able to trace to date is the information I referred to in the book by Geoffrey Brooks, another British author, who mentions in a work that he wrote called Hitler's Terror Weapons that the Bell may have actually ended up in Argentina. He cites sources from the Argentine news agency Nequin, and he indicates that basically it's his belief that the Bell actually ended up at that plasma physics laboratory that General Perón had built for the Nazis in Bariloche province of Argentina. Right. Now, I have not been able to pursue that any further than to suggest along his lines that the Bell may have ended up there, because certainly the Junkers 390 aircraft that was flown out of Germany toward the end of the war was capable of making that nonstop flight from Europe to Argentina. In fact, I think I mentioned with Whitley and Jim Mars that this aircraft was one of the first in the world that was equipped for mid-air refueling. Right. So in addition to its extraordinary operational range just on the basis of the fuel that it would carry, in addition to that, it was capable of being refueled in midair. So, we're dealing with an aircraft that was way ahead of its time in certain respects. So it's very likely that it may have ended up there. And, the other line that I indicate in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell is that the only other trail really leads to this country, and that's kind of the feeling of Nick Cook and Igor Vitkovsky themselves, that it probably ended up in this country in some black project over here.
Mm-hmm. The information that you had presented on the Bell possibly winding up at that plasma lab in Bariloche rang a bell for me, only because Bariloche had been a center and may still be a center of emigre war criminals in the immediate post-war period in the late 1940s and 50s. Mossad was up in there looking for Mengele at one point.
Really?
It was kind of famous. It's right across the border from Chile, and it's believed that when they raided that famous Nazi encampment, Colonia Dignidad in Chile, that you mentioned in your book,
right.
That the leader, Paul Schaefer, had managed to go across the border into Argentina and wound up for a while in Bariloche. So there's been a lot of sort of Nazi activity in that part of Argentina because it is a little inaccessible,
right.
from either coast. It's right up in the mountains. There's a ski resort up there and everything, and it was pretty congenial for the Nazis and other Germans who were trying to escape the war. So
right.
that just seemed relevant to me at the time when I came across it. I was reading a lot when I was researching Unholy Alliance, which is all about the Nazis and secret societies. I was trying to find out.
A superb book, incidentally. It's one of my favorite books.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. I was trying to research some of the Nazi secret technology back in those days. I was researching that book really in the early 90s, and I came across a book by R.V. Jones called Most Secret War, British Scientific Intelligence from 1939 to 1945. It's a thick book. It's over 500 pages. And I went through there finding virtually nothing of interest until the very last couple of pages when he mentioned that there was a UFO flap at one point where British Scientific Intelligence thought that there were UFOs being flown using Nazi technology, and that perhaps either the Russians had captured it or the Germans had captured it, and he, a member of British intelligence, had investigated it and found it to be nothing, and all the sightings were probably of meteors and all the usual stories we've come to hear over the last 60 years or so. And I was amazed, here we have an enormously thick book, and it really talked more about some of the stuff we already know, and then just happened to end with a reference to the UFOs and a complete dismissal of them. And I wondered why it was even important to have that one last page in there about the UFOs.
Right.
But there's an example, the
Exactly.
information exists, as you've shown in your book. The documentation exists. We have Witkowski's research. We have your own research. And here we have, the mainstream people saying, well, it never really happened,
it's interesting.
Document.
Well, it's interesting because, I'm sure that you're aware that anytime we enter this sort of field, ufology in particular, and then when we add Nazis into the mix on top of that, it's extremely difficult. It's like entering a hall of mirrors. So it's very difficult to document, and you have to really sift the evidence very, very carefully. I try to do that. I don't know how successful I am, but it's very, very difficult. And my suspicion is that in that book he's probably letting out a little information that with the typical spin that he has to put on it. But my impression is from reading sources like that usually when they do stuff like that, they're trying to kind of clue people in that there might be more of a story here than meets the eye.
Well, speaking of that, when you mix together Nazis and the UFOs, that's one big problem, and then you throw in the Kennedy assassination on top of it, which is really the subtitle of your book. Now we're really in Wonderland, aren't we?
Yes, exactly.
And the funny thing is, there is so much circumstantial evidence to link all of these three phenomena that it's incredible, isn't it?
Well, it is. It's something that you mentioned actually in I think it's the second volume of Sinister Forces that the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination are there leading up to it and then leading away from it. So there is definitely a connection there. I'm kind of surprised personally that so much of it was, of course, uncovered by Jim Garrison during his investigation, and yet I don't even think he really knew what to do with it. It's almost mystifying that there's so much of it there. And certainly it was never mentioned by Oliver Stone in his movie, and I thought that was kind of peculiar. So that's kind of the reason I decided to pursue a little bit of that in the book. I think that we have to look for a sufficient motivation for the Nazis to have been involved in the assassination, and I come down to the fact that they were protecting their own vested interests that they had established via Operation Paperclip and the deal that General Galen had cut with Allen Dulles before the war ended to have the CIA essentially take over German military intelligence. And then we add into that mix the Nazi technology itself, which I think may have been deliberately threatened in a certain way with exposure by some of President Kennedy's moves to open up the space program and begin joint explorations with the Soviet Union and so on. So, yeah, you're right. It's a very, very kind of distressing subject to have to deal with.
Well, you actually take the whole Kennedy assassination theory, or what should we call it, the Kennedy assassination brouhaha, you take it up to another level completely, one which is believable. I mean, it's credible. If we know we brought Nazis over during Paperclip, we know that Truman, for instance, vigorously opposed bringing the Nazi scientists over and actually gave the orders not to, and he was ignored by the military. So we know this was happening. We know we brought the Nazis over. We know we brought Dornberger over and Werner von Braun and all the rest. All this is a fact.
Right.
We also know, I mean, if we have any common sense, that people who were dedicated Nazis were not going to give up their beliefs that easily. The only people they were friendly with were other Nazis, other military men, or other intelligence people in the German military machine. And this was the network that they had. And you point that out, I think, quite correctly, and something that I've been saying as well, that the Nazi network did not suddenly disappear overnight just because they lost the war.
Right.
They kept in touch. They traded information. So we have, we're dealing with in our country another kind of clandestine shadow government. I mean, is it your belief that, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, I'm not even going to speculate, but is this the kind of network that would still exist? I mean, even into the 21st century, do you think it's pretty much dissipated by now?
No, I think something of it remains, and my impression is, I've read a lot of different literature, and there's a certain group of people that believe that there is a kind of a rogue element loose in the American national security apparatus, and I happen to believe that that's essentially correct, and that it has been loose more or less really since the Kennedy era, if not before. And so I think the historical connection that one has to draw is that rogue element has its historical roots, really, in the deal that American intelligence struck with the German military intelligence before the war ended. And that really we have to look for the roots for this renegade rogue element there. And I would not be at all surprised that as you point out in many of your books, these Nazi networks are alive and well in South America. They may be somewhat weaker now, but they still exist, and I wouldn't be at all surprised, speculating a little bit, that something of this Nazi international remains to this day.
Well, I thought it was especially true, at least up until the end of the Cold War, where there were obviously two forces fighting each other. I mean, the Nazis were definitely anti-communist, and so were we, so that was a marriage made in hell, perhaps, but it lasted for at least as long as the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, my first concern was Arab terrorism, basically.
Yes.
This is long before other people were worried about it, but I was worried about, people like Saddam Hussein and worried about various dictators and thinking that we shouldn't dismantle our intelligence apparatus the way everyone was telling us we should,
right.
Simply because the communists had decided to throw in the towel.
Right.
And, everyone thought I was crazy. Then, of course, a few years later, then all hell broke loose. But I'm wondering now, cui bono, as they say in legal parlance, who's benefiting now from the current state of affairs? Does the Nazi network, such as it is, and we're now talking about a new generation, a generation that's been brought up under their influence, essentially.
Right.
Does the new Nazi international, let's call them, have a stake in what's going on in world affairs now, and if so, which side would they be on? And my reason for asking this question is the technology that you discuss in your books. Right. Who's got it, and how would it be used in the event that this world situation becomes even hairier than it is now?
Well, those are excellent questions, and really I think that the connection that exists between Nazism and radical Islam that began to be established before the war, I think that certainly was maintained by the Nazis and aided and abetted after the war. We have the case of several German scientists, for example, going to Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt after the war to basically become military advisors to the Nasser regime. And there's no doubt in my mind, I haven't yet been able to trace out any further Nazi connections. I do know that they were involved in trying to arrange an early Iraqi coup during the war, during the 41-42 period in conjunction with German military operations in North Africa and the Soviet Union. So the connections are there. They're very deep. It's just that no one has really given the time or put in the effort to explore what those connections may be. Now, the second part of your question, I think, is also a good one concerning the technology and would they construe a situation or a scenario possibly where they would actually deploy this technology in a situation that would seem to require it? And I think that the answer has to be yes. If they're involved in some of these international manipulations behind the Arab terrorist network, and I think that a case can be made that they are, then I think that we have to consider the fact that they're really manipulating this for their own purposes, and it would probably be to set up a kind of an apocalyptic scenario where they arrive on the scene and save the day. that would right. kind of be my guess.
That's your best guess, actually. That's the best.
Yeah, I think as far as who controls this technology, again, we go back to the fact that the Bell probably disappeared either into this country and its black projects or that they maintained a completely independent control over it when it disappeared into Argentina, depending on which route you take for the Bell and its technology. If it disappeared into this country, there's no doubt in my mind that they managed to maintain some sort of quasi-independent control over the technology that it represented. And the reason I say that is in the book I present various evidence that even the Nazi rocket scientists were acting more or less quasi-independently throughout their entire period of employment in our space program and in America's missile programs. So there's no doubt in my mind that that pattern of behavior would have continued and persisted, if not even stronger, in the case of a project as sensitive as the Bell was. So the answer to that question is yes, I think that they maintained their control over this technology at some point.
Well, I think it's interesting, probably important for our listeners to realize that even though we brought the Nazis here after World War II and employed them and used their knowledge and their abilities in our space program, even though we began to call them our Germans and our Nazis, they really weren't. I mean, they were their Nazis and their Germans, and that the situation that we face now, as you rightly point out, and as I've researched as well, the Nazis did support Middle Eastern despots and dictators for years, both during and after the war.
Right.
And continue to teach their secret police, to train their secret police, their scientists to their, as far as we know, Alois Brunner is still in Damascus, Syria, a famous wanted Nazi war criminal protected by the Syrian government, on and on and on. So what we have is a situation where we are now engaged in this horrible mess over in the Middle East. We can't seem to extricate ourselves from that. The Nazis who were supporting us, in a sense, during the Cold War, because we had a common enemy.
Right.
Now we may be forced to the realization that these people have now switched allegiances. They have their own agenda. And if they want anything for this country, it could be exactly, the direction in which the country is going, which is towards less freedom, heightened security, more of a rigid authoritarian state, which is something which they had in Germany and which they may be agitating for here. I mean, I'm speculating at this point, but we are faced with the realization that we have a terrible situation. The Nazi network has not gone away, and in your books you detail a weapon of some frightening capability. And technology of some massive capability. So, I'm naturally concerned about whose hands this is in.
Well, I happen to agree with you, and in fact, again, I think it was Mae Brussel that pointed out that since the Kennedy assassination, America's freedoms have been steadily eroded, and we're to the point now where those freedoms are threatened by a technology that exists largely in the hands and control of the various elites that run the country. So, I happen to agree with you that if they have switched allegiances, there's no doubt in my mind that they have, that one of the things that they're quietly pushing for behind the scenes is exactly what you say, an even further curtailment and trying to head America towards an authoritarian state. Absolutely, I agree.
Well, I'm also concerned that people who really don't have our best interests at heart would be in control of some of this technology. And there must have been development of this technology over the last 60 years. I mean, it freeze at that point. So who knows, to what degree this technology has been modified, perhaps made more portable, perhaps made even more dangerous. So we have no way of knowing that since all this information is classified.
Well, one of the things that I mentioned in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell is that on my analysis of the known signature effects and other things that we know about the Bell, based on Witkowski's research and his access to Polish government archives and so on, what we know about it indicates to me that the Nazis had put in place a Manhattan-sized project for the investigation and development of areas of quantum mechanics, including weaponization of quantum potential or zero-point energy, if you will, and that they were busily developing this kind of scalar physics. So, to me, the Bell represents a kind of a prototype technology in this direction. But I also point out in the book that this technology, this type of physics, was very probably developed by the Soviet Union, having acquired some of its own Nazi experts from the Nazi radar teams toward the end of the war, and it certainly was quite successful. I didn't mention this in the book, but it was successful in miniaturizing components of this type of physics. The Brazilians as well took over their own kind of team of Nazi scientists and developed this type of weaponry. So, you know, we're dealing with a South American major power that has access to this physics. So we're dealing with a very, very frightening scenario. And I think you're right to point out that it's been 60-some years since the Bell was first experimented upon. And the development that they took in that time subsequently has to have been significant in both miniaturization and making its destructive potential even more frightening, and that to me is a very disturbing prospect.
Well, it is to me too, and that's what I took away from reading your book. The fact that this technology that you're discussing was frightening. It's frightening now, and it's 60 years old. You know, so
right, exactly.
Whatever may have transpired since then is even more frightening. You also, in your book, you seem to lend a lot of credence to the Magic 12 documents, or you seem to use them a lot in trying to understand what really went on. And I think that I read Stanton Friedman's book, of course, on Majestic 12, and then I've read yours, and you seem to make a lot of very good points why we should take those documents seriously.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Stanton Friedman. I've read both his work on the Magic 12 documents and Kevin Randall's kind of rebuttal, I guess you would say, of Stanton Friedman. I've read them both. The documents that I use in the book are not actually the same documents that they have based most of their research on. So my approach was rather different than theirs. I was not really concerned with issues of provenance or authenticity as much as I was concerned with what does the internal evidence of the documents themselves have to say about whatever technology crashed at Roswell and what might the implications be. So I kind of leave the documents themselves in what Friedman calls his gray basket. I'm not convinced that they're entirely authentic. I'm certainly of the opinion that they're not entirely hoaxes either, and that they contain some genuine information, and that's kind of my point of departure.
Right, I understood that, and I thought that was a very good approach to take. Instead of going overboard trying to prove the actual physical documents were genuine, the internal evidence itself is very compelling, and you make a very good case for it. I think that has the UFO community out there embraced the approach that you've taken? Do you know? I mean, has there been any feedback?
Well, there hasn't really been any feedback about the book or my approach to the documents. I don't really think the book is probably that well known to them yet. If it ever is, there might be some feedback. The only approaches I've really had are people that have written me personally or emailed me personally with their thoughts about it. And for the most part, those responses I've had tend to run positively towards my approach. I've had one or two people that absolutely dismiss it, but for the most part, most of the people think that the approach is sound and that the idea that it may have been something certainly exotic technologically that crashed there, I don't think that anyone would doubt that. But they acknowledge the fact that I seem to have made a fairly decent, prima facie case that if it was exotic, it was nevertheless not exotic enough, really, to be extraterrestrial. It represents a terrestrial technology that's been combined in some very creative and unusual ways. And to me, that combining of technologies in creative ways is a hallmark, really, of the types of things that the Nazis were up to in their secret weapons projects. And I try and document that case in both books.
How do you feel about the... do feel that the UFO phenomenon, of course, is much older than Roswell? Do you feel that there is a separate phenomenon taking place, which is not part of the technology we're discussing? That there's a genuine kind of. Yeah.
Oh yes, I make it. I try and make it clear in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell that I do not believe that Nazi technology or any terrestrially based technology can explain all UFO sightings or contactee or abduction experiences. It's only applicable in a certain very limited number of cases, and I certainly don't close my mind to the fact that there is something else, some other type of phenomenon that we're dealing with the UFO phenomenon. So my real concern and approach in the book has simply been to limit myself to the cases of Roswell and Kecksburg, which are two of the more famous crash and recovery cases, and to examine the documentary or the witness evidence on the basis of, can we explain the technologies that have been described in the documents or by the witnesses by reference to actual physics papers or known concepts in certain areas of theoretical physics. And I think that the answer there is yes in those two cases. So it's a very limited approach that I'm taking.
But isn't it fascinating from the point of view of disinformation that in order to shield or cloak the technology that our government was developing at that time, they had to basically invalidate the entire UFO phenomenon to do it. I mean, they only had those two choices, either accept it or not. I mean, if they were to accept the UFO phenomenon, then it would lead the door wide open to their own technology. So what they had to do was say, there's nothing out there.
Yeah, exactly so. And again, this is kind of my interpretation of the Magic 12 documents that I refer to in the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, is that it's my belief, based on the study again of the internal evidence, that the ET explanation was put out, I think, as a kind of a final deep cover layer of disinformation to mislead people into what may have actually had occurred there. You know, my thinking is that if it was something Nazi or based in German wartime technology that had crashed there, that and there's every technological indication that it was, that if that was so, nothing is going to send the American military into the panic that it went into on the basis of the crash faster than the realization that somebody somewhere is continuing this line of development independently of any of the so-called victorious powers that won the war. So, you know, I think that there is a rational explanation as to why the military reacted with such a clampdown on the phenomenon from that point of view.
You made an interesting statement there. You said that something was being developed outside of the victorious powers. Do you think that possibly was the case at some point? Do you think that after the end of the war, our so-called Nazi International was independent in doing what it was doing?
Yes, I do, and the reason why there are little indicators from time to time that the Nazis themselves that dispersed into various countries around the world gave little clues that they gave that this work was continuing to be done independently under their influence and control. One of the most famous of which is the famous SS commando Otto Skorzeny, who after the war lived for most of his life in Spain, in Madrid. And at one point, he actually publicly stated that he approached the Americans with some of this avant-garde so-called UFO technology and offered to sell it to us. So in other words, the implication is that, number one, he has access to it. Number two, it's being developed independently. Number three, they maintain control over it. So the implication of that's kind of staggering, but it fits everything else that we know about what the Nazis did after the war, particularly in South America with the laboratory that General Perón built for them. And if the Bell made its way there, then yes, there's every indication that they continue to develop this stuff independently.
Well, and to anticipate any listeners who might have the following question in their mind, it would take a lot of money to finance this research, but then again, that's what Skorzeny had control of. One hell of a lot of money. I mean, Skorzeny was funneling funds all over the place that had been stolen during the war. So to anticipate your listeners' questions, yes, it would take a lot of money, I'm sure, but at the same time, the Nazi International, whether you want to call it Odessa or anything else, Die Spinne, the Kameradenwerke, they had access to large amounts of money, which was then augmented by some of the regimes in which they were operating. If Perón's building them a laboratory, it's because he's expecting to have some great benefits from it. It's almost like the Middle Ages when the kings and the emperors would hire alchemists to make gold.
Right. Exactly.
That's what the Nazis were basically doing for them with this technology. Well, would have been gold.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy to the Middle Ages and alchemy, because another thing I point out in the book is that Walter Gerlach, who was, of course, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, the physicist that actually headed up the Bell Project, wrote an article several years, in fact, before the war, and I cite this in the book, where he refers to the prospects of a new kind of alchemy based on some of the observations that German physicists were making with mercury of all subjects in their laboratories.
Yeah, your chapter on or your section on red mercury, of course, which became a big hot topic about 10 or 15 years ago when it hit all the news reports and magazines and everything else. There was this mysterious element that was being transported, illegally after the fall of the Soviet Union. Everyone was frightened of it, and the first thing I thought of was alchemy when I heard that.
Yes, exactly.
It's the first thing you think of. That's pretty much disappeared. I mean, the news about that, the hysteria over that, just pretty much went away, hasn't it?
It
you
has,
don't hear much
and
about it anymore.
Yeah, it has. There was a recent kind of resurgence of it in a different way when, during the first Bush administration, it became known at some point in the last couple of years that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, was doing research into unlocking the energy in the hafnium-178-2 metastable state isomer. And of course, the quest was for a hafnium bomb. And again, that kind of research is more or less the same sort of thing that they were looking for with red mercury, which is basically a type of conventional explosive that will be capable of detonating a hydrogen bomb without the use of an atomic bomb as the fuse, so to speak. So, it kind of surfaced in another way. There was a lot of controversy over whether or not they were able to achieve any significant results with their research. But, it's a fascinating area. And, again, I think the analogy to medieval kings and alchemy is exactly dead on. This is exactly what Perón was after. And as far as, you mentioned the funding, I kind of wanted to respond to that a bit. It's my belief, I haven't at this point uncovered any solid evidence, but it's my belief or my intuition, as it were, that the Nazis that made their way to South America very quickly weaseled their way into or ingratiated themselves with what would become the drug lords down there. And I believe that a lot of source of their funding is from that type of activity, involvement in the drug trade and so on and so forth. As you point out in your Unholy Alliance book, there's certainly the implication that the Nazis managed to weasel their way into the security services of various South American nations and basically formed the nucleus of the death squads that existed down there in several countries. So I think we can look at a kind of a pattern that exhibits itself there and kind of extrapolate from that they probably entered into agreements with the various drug cartels as well.
Well, I think in the case of Klaus Barbie, it's proven Klaus Barbie, the former SS commander who was caught in Bolivia. On both counts, yes, he infiltrated the secret services. I mean, he basically ran security for Bolivia. At one point for the Bolivian government, he was the head of their secret police, but he also ran drugs. And as they found out just recently, in the last year or so, when they captured Paul Schaefer from Colonia Dignidad, they began to reveal details of his operation there. And this has been coming out slowly in bits and pieces, but we found out that his airstrip at the colony was used for that purpose. They had planes going in and out running drugs, guns, and money. Because he was basically an independent state within a state, right on the border between Argentina and Chile, so he had excellent access. And he had an airstrip and he had anti-aircraft weapons. So this was a guy who was running a lot of money in and out, which is why he was protected for so long. Because he wasn't doing this only for the Nazis, he was doing it for the Chilean military as well. Generals and colonels who had their hands in various tills and who were involved in the drug trade themselves. So we know so far this was going on. So if they were taking a piece out of the drug income of the world, even if it was only a small percentage of it, they would have had more than enough money to continue funding research, scientific research of this kind.
Right. Exactly. You mentioned Skorzeny in regard to the finances. I've always thought it extremely curious that Skorzeny was married to the daughter of the president of the Reichsbank under Hitler, and that was Hjalmar Schacht.
Yeah.
And of course, there's another connection to the Kennedy assassination because Hjalmar Schacht eventually ends up in the employment of Aristotle Onassis. So it just gets crazy the more you look.
Oh, it's extremely incestuous, which is why, conspiracy theorists go nuts when they start looking at this because they don't know what to make of it. And you can't walk away from it and say, well, there's no conspiracy, it was all coincidence. I mean, that's
right, exactly.
You can't walk away from it. But by the same token, when you look at it as a conspiracy, you don't know where it begins or ends,
Right.
Because eventually you start talking about what we talk about, and that's Nazis and UFOs and the Kennedy assassination and who knows what else. And then everybody stops listening, and they say, yeah, right, go back to the X-Files, we'll talk to you later. But what are you going to do? The documents are screaming for this type of interpretation. There's no way to escape it. That's the problem. It is so unbelievable, but there it is.
Yeah, exactly. And, you mentioned academics earlier sitting in their tenured ivory towers and not writing about this stuff. Well, I used to teach as a college professor, so I know exactly what you mean. I would have been absolutely drummed out of my various faculties that I was involved with had I published any of this stuff while I was still a college professor. So, yeah, the pressure's on, and that raises another interesting point. I think that many of these professors, particularly in history faculties, are aware of these things, but they're just too frightened to write about it. Just look what has happened to David Mack and the other fellow that writes on UFO technology and abductions, and they're basically ostracized by their fellow faculty members. So the pressure's there.
Well, since I published Sinister Forces, I started to get a lot of contact, a lot of communications, emails from college professors who were tentatively giving me a little bit of more information that they had uncovered, and these are guys in tenured positions who don't want to necessarily be, mentioned, but they were very helpful. They gave me bits and pieces of information that I didn't know existed, and it helped me to put together even a bigger story, but they can't publish on their own. They can't endanger themselves this way. And, for the listeners, this is part of the problem that you'll face when you start to research this material, and that is that a lot of people are going to say, well, this is not mainstream history. But mainstream history is history that has been sanitized,
absolutely.
Just to keep everybody quiet and keep everybody calm. It's been cleaned up and sanitized. If you look at the documents, just go to the same documents that Joseph Farrell's looked at, that I've looked at, even the declassified FBI files from the 1940s.
Right.
I mean, look at those documents and ask yourself, what is Guy Bannister doing in the Pacific Northwest, investigating UFOs and sending telexes back to J. Edgar Hoover, titled subject X, you know.
Right.
I mean, here's declassified files. You can look at them for yourself. There it is. What does this mean? You know, what is the relationship here? We have Guy Bannister, the famous figure from the Oliver Stone film, who was played by Ed Asner, as the former FBI man in charge of this anti-Castro Cuban operation in New Orleans.
Right.
And you know, years before in the 40s, he was investigating UFO reports. He was interviewing UFO contactees. He was sending the information back to Hoover, and it was all part of the X-Files. This was in 1947, ladies and gentlemen. And then he shows up again in the Kennedy assassination, as you pointed out. And Fred Krisman, you know, here's Fred Krisman.
Right.
Here's this guy who had a UFO rain on top of him. He was involved in the Maury Island incident back in 1947 at the same time in the same area that Bannister was operating. And now Fred Krisman's a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. These things they strain credulity, and yet the papers are there, the documents and files are there. These guys have been interviewed. You know, they were suspects. You know, how do they all wind up in New Orleans, you know, with Lee Harvey Oswald, no less? How does that happen?
Well, you know, that was the most fascinating thing about your books when I read this in them, and, you know, you can take a lot of credit for exposing that aspect of it because it was entirely unknown to me. And when I read it, I was really just blown away. And, again, I think that the implication is that since we had Bannister and Krisman involved in UFOs, and then we subsequently find them involved on the periphery of the Kennedy assassination, that, again, the implication is there's some hidden story of technological suppression, I think, that's going on here, and that we have to look and consider very seriously that this was one of, certainly not the only, but one of the major motivations involved behind the assassination. Somebody was trying to protect something.
Yeah, and I think that you put your finger on it. I mean, reading your book put me into a whole different frame of mind regarding the assassination. I had always thought there was something to do with it, especially as all the people who worked for Riley Coffee Company with Oswald all got jobs at NASA after the assassination. All of these things, I mean, you're forced to some kind of conclusion, you know, but the fact that it might have been a technology that was being protected, the fact that, you know, the scientists we brought over were carrying information that would have blown the covers off of anything like the atomic bomb. I mean, all of this made me think about it in a different way, and I think your book was very valuable for that point, for that reason. It uncovered a whole other aspect of this, of our secret history. It's our secret history, isn't it? I mean, you have a line in your book by one of the German authors who said, you know, greetings from secret Germany, you know.
Right.
And we have to start thinking about secret America. I mean, what is the secret behind who we are and our government and what we've been doing, and you know, what don't we know about our own history? I think that it's writers like you that are helping to uncover, you know, some of this. It's very important work.
Well, the most disturbing thing I think that I ran across was precisely this reference to secret Germany, and you're as aware as I am that, you know, there's a connection between secret Germany and secret America, and unfortunately it's sitting in the White House right now, you know. It's
you really want to go there
now?
How much more time do we have?
Sure, if you wish.
No, I know, of course, there is a connection, obviously. You know, it goes back to the 1920s and 1930s, and it's just, you know, I mean, we know that ideologically, a lot of people in this country, yes?
We're going to need to revisit, I think. We've come to the end of the usual amount of time for our subscriber interviews, and I think that the two of you need to get together with us as flies on the walls again, because this is absolutely fascinating, but we're getting ready to go down a whole nother path in terms of subjects, and obviously it was Ann Strieber's idea to put the two of you together, and it was a good one. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I'm sure the rest of my subscribers and I did. Good Lord, I mean, I'm flying right now. Perhaps too far.
Come back with me.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you both very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.